Welcome to the Shetland Times podcast. I'm your host, Thor Holt, and today we've got a couple of previous Fetlar folk on the show for you. Apologies in advance, the Skype line which we used to record most of these calls wasn't particularly good, so there's a few breakdowns in sound quality. I'll do my best with the edit, but yes, apologies if the line breaks down a couple of times. Hope you enjoy the conversation though with John and Jane Coutts. So Jane, what was it brought you to Shetland in the first place? You don't sound like you're originally from Shetland.
No, I'm not originally from Shetland, but I lived there about 16 years, I think, and I had studied languages originally, so when I came out of university and there wasn't very much opportunity in Britain, I went to work in Germany and Italy, Denmark for a little while as well. And when I came back, there still wasn't much opportunity. So I retrained, effectively. I did an MPhil in sociology / anthropology. And it was the days when there was quite a lot of early interest in diversification and community consultation and things in the Highlands and Islands. And one of the projects that came out of all of that was the development plan in Fetlar, and I went up largely connected with that.
Great, so your first port of call in Shetland was Fetlar, is that right? Was that the first place you went to?
That was my only port of call in Fetlar. in Shetland, rather, sorry. Actually, when we had been there for quite some time, I was often asked why, when I was running the museum in Fetlar, why I didn't think of moving on to the mainland, because it was quite professionally isolated for me in Fetlar. But my answer was that Fetlar is what I understood, and Fetlar was where most of my skills were needed, so that the logical thing was for me to continue to operate from there. So Fetlar was really my only port of call in Shetland, realistically.
So that's where you lived for the whole time you were there?
Yeah, apart from a year when I worked in yeah.
When you worked in where? Say that again, the line broke down again.
Oh, I worked in Lerwick for about a year.
Was that at the museum, or where was that?
No, it was at the Arts Trust.
The Arts Trust.
Yeah.
Super. And John, where are you from then? Obviously from Shetland originally by the accent, but what part?
I'm from Fetlar, yes. I grew up in Fetlar.
Is this a Fetlar romance story we're going to get here?
Probably, yes. Yes.
Well, I was going to tell me that story. Come on. How did you guys meet?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, we met in Fetlar, and that was it. Here we are 26 years later or something. Yeah.
So was it? Come on now, guys. You can't hold out on me. Was it a dance or something? What was the? How did people meet on Fetlar 26 years ago?
No.
I think John just liked speaking, and I liked speaking as well, so we ended up speaking together.
Yeah, that's kind of, yes.
We had quite a lot of interests in common, I think, which in a small community is not easy.
No, I know. I'm from a small community. I'm from Papastua, so I know what a small community can be like. It can be great, and it can be not so great, depending on on a number of things. So what did you do then, John, back then?
I'm trying to remember. Back then, I was working to the community council in Fetlar for a while. They, in the 1980s, they were encouraging people to come and live and work in Fetlar because the population was very low. Mm-hmm. I was involved in that. That got a lot of very high publicity. The British media and that. And we had quite a lot of success under that too. And I worked on the ferries, of course. I spent a few years working on Dental Island Ferry in Shetland.
Great. And can you give me
Sorry?
Sorry, the line broke down a bit there, John. Sometimes these Skype lines are great, and sometimes they go a bit wrong. It's going a wee bit wrong. Tell me, John, can you give me an example of one of the success stories, or a disaster story, either would be fun, from folk that you got to come and live on Fetlar? Can you remember any examples?
Well, the people that ended up running the shop in Fetlar came through under my efforts. That were the Boxhall family. Nick has gone back to, I think he's in England now, and they no longer live there. But, some of their children are still in Shetland and that. I cannot remember, to be honest, what all happened.
You'd maybe not want to tell me if there was a total disaster story. We wouldn't want to name and shame anybody.
There was some.
Leave that out. There were some, yeah.
I do remember one character that told me he worked in the SAS, and I'm afraid he had a few problems, and I'm glad to say he chose not to come at the end. But most of the people were very sensible and hoped to come and live, and in many cases they simply couldn't do it because of various, usually financial problems. But we got a lot of interested people, nevertheless.
This might be obvious to folk that have been there recently, but I haven't been to Fetlar since I was a wee kid. So what do people do there? What's the main sources of, you mentioned finances, but what's the main source of employment there?
Well, the ferries provided a lot of employment since the early 90s, well, 92, 93, I think. The ferries ended up being a big wage earner for the island. Prior to that, then that sort of thing. People tend to have more than one job. They'll get a job with the water or the post or whatever is going, pretty much. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what do you guys do now then? Am I right in thinking you have shifted from Shetland to somewhere in Spain? Is that right?
Yeah. That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, we live in a place in Spain which is probably about as remote as Fetlar is in Scotland. Yeah.
Where is it? You don't have to give us the exact location, but give me a rough clue.
Extremadura. Extremadura is sort of aligned with the Portuguese border, but it's in the middle. It's not on either of the coasts, so it's right in the middle. Yeah, and it's quite remote in Spanish terms. It's one of those places that gets forgotten by Madrid, and so socially and economically, it's got quite a hard history. It had a tough time during the Civil War, so there's the odd story there that is still very difficult for people to tell. But I was in Germany recently. I often go back to Germany because my background's really in German, and the Germans, have done over the years a tremendous job of sort of soul searching and coming to terms with what happened in the 30s, and during the war. And I'm not sure Spain has really started to do that, coming to terms with its own history. It has tried to start. It's made efforts to start, but there are still quite big divisions about whether it ought to. And so a region like this is quite, its history has a lot of secrets to tell.
Mm-hmm. And what is it you guys are doing there? Are you just on a sabbatical, or have you got something professional going on there?
Not a sabbatical, no.
Do you want to start, John?
Well, I write web content for companies all over the world. I was doing that in Fetlar, actually. So I just transferred everything here. And the great thing about that is I'm independent of Spain. I pay my taxes here, obviously, but it's something I can take with me wherever I go, pretty much. So.
I'm glad that you added in that you pay your taxes there, just in case there's any tax collectors from any part of the European Union listening.
Oh, no, we didn't want to come here and be illegal in any sense. No, there's no sense in doing that.
So what kind of web content do you write? What kind of things?
Whatever is required. It depends on the people that want it. That's all kind of stuff. That's mostly articles about various subjects. And I got a job in there about replacement windows. That's mundane things like that. It can be anything.
How did you get into that? Were you forced into it by something
on
Fetlar, or what's your background to end up doing that?
I hated working on the ferries. I get seasick.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. That's great.
It's true. I mean, the North Isles, the sea around the North Isles in winter, it's not calm. And I really I never was actually physically sick, but I would feel sick every day, and it was very uncomfortable. It was awful. Yeah. So I ended up starting a small company and writing web content, and I just built it up. You just go there and say to a company that looks like they might need some writing, do you need anything? And some will say yes, and some will say no.
Great. Were you into writing when you were younger, like at school? Were you into writing, or did you ever? I'm just fascinated. It seems quite a change from working on the ferry to writing. It's great.
I used to write poetry and things, and write songs and all that kind of stuff.
You wrote for the Shetland Times.
Yeah, that's true. I'd forgotten that, but I wrote the Shetland Times. They did a thing they possibly still do, where people in various parts of Shetland were writing about the news and that, in their area. And I wrote for the North Isles, the Unstgill and Fetlar. So I did that for about 10 years, I think, actually. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I can't believe you were going to not mention that you wrote for the Shetland Times on the Shetland Times podcast. So thank you, Jane.
I'd forgotten, actually.
Good save, Jane. Good save.
Yeah.
And for some years, I looked at Shetland Times web too. Actually, I started the Shetland Times website, come to think on it. That's come to be quite a long time ago. I forget. Early 90s, 1990s, I think. Yeah.
So hold on a minute. Now we found out you started the Shetland Times website.
Well, I'm not sure. I would say maybe it's wrong to say I started it. No, that was when you went online. I was involved in. You need to ask Robert Wishart. He was the one I was dealing with, and I've forgotten all the detail, to be honest.
No, but this is a good story that it would be good to flesh out for the Shetland Times podcast. Maybe we'll have a second episode just about this.
Yeah.
Give him time to think about it.
I've forgotten all the detail, but I used to update it, and they would send news stories, and I would update it and all that. Oh, the technical stuff, really. I wasn't writing too much at that point for the Shetland Times. It was mostly the technical detail I was dealing with at that time. Mid to late 90s, I think I was doing that, if I recall right.
Great. And what do you do then, Jane?
Right. How many hours have you got?
Well, we've got as much time as you've got story. You just go for
it. Well, I translate. I do what's called English correction, mostly for university or people in that sort of area whose native language isn't English, and they have to write their theses or conference papers or whatever out in English, and so I correct those. I also teach. I do some teaching. I teach in the nearest city. I do the courses on. They're called oposiciones in Spanish. They're all the teachers in Spain are civil servants, and everybody wants to be a civil servant because they have these tremendous conditions for life, and but to get to become a civil servant de oposición, you have to pass a sort of competitive exam, and I teach the teachers who want to take that exam, and it's quite a heavy curriculum they have to get through. So that's what I do usually, mostly secondary, but some primary as well, and. I also am what they call affiliate researcher at University of Glasgow, and I help them with projects connected with rabies prevention in Tanzania.
Why are you laughing? Is this because you've got...
I'm laughing because most people would say this is you're having me on with all of these different things, but yeah, so I've been out to Tanzania a few times in the last few years. I'm the sociologist, effectively, and my colleagues are vets and epidemiologists and so on, and they try to vaccinate dogs against rabies, but there's been a very... there's a lot of difficulty, a lot of sort of mismatch, in a way, between the scientific side of rabies prevention and the social side, actually how to implement rabies prevention plans in local areas. And so they brought me in to bridge the gap. So I do consultation in the villages in Tanzania. It's very systematic consultation to find out what the barriers might be to some of the sort of best practice ideas of, for preventing rabies, and to help produce local plans for overcoming those barriers without huge inputs of funding, without having to change government policy, things like that, things that people can do locally without too much disruption to their life and without any expense. So that's what we do.
Sorry,
that's what we do in Tanzania, more or less. And I still write. So that's the other thing. I published a book a couple of years ago, and I'm working on another one that's got a first draft completely ready. So, and they're about Shetland.
Book? Oh, that's what I was going to ask. Thank you. Go on then. What was the last book?
The previous one was a biography of Sir William Watson Chain, who was Lister's bacteriological assistant, and therefore probably the first but probably the first medical bacteriologist in Britain. Mm-hmm. And he'd been known as Lister's assistant for a long time. He came from Fetlar, and when I was working in the museum in Fetlar, we amassed a huge amount of information about him because the family still kept their house on the island, the house that he built there. And when I started working on it, I discovered that medical historians all over Britain wondered where his papers were. No biography had been written of him because his scientific work was available and documented, but very little about himself, and nobody really knew where it was. So I realised that we were actually sitting on quite a lot of it, and that it was time to write his biography. So I gave a paper at a conference in London for the Lister Centenary, and people encouraged me to do it there. So that's really how that started. And that was published a couple of years ago. And I always said that when I left the museum in Fetlar, I'd put together all the documentation as a story from the two big houses. So this is about the other one, Broch Lodge, mm-hmm. and the people who built it and the people who lived in it over the years. And it's extraordinary, really, what's come up. It's an absolutely extraordinary story, but I'll leave that till it's published.
Now, come on, give us a taster, Jane. Give me
a taster of it. Well, now the man who built it was the man who perpetrated the clearances in Fetlar, and that's really how he's known. But what I wanted to look at is how that came to be. What were the influences on him as a person mm-hmm. that led him to do those things? And that documentation, mostly from the Shetland Archives, has thrown up a huge amount of interest, a huge amount of interesting background to why the clearances happened in Fetlar. I think until now everybody's, there's quite a lot been written on the clearances themselves, the kind of land management and the influences on land management and things like that. But the influences on the actual people that did it probably could do with a bit of expanding. So that's what I'm doing here. And he had a fascinating childhood and youth, and was all over the place. And so that sort of brought into it. And the second family that inherited it afterwards were largely brought back to manage it from Australia. And I've already published an article, actually, in Shetland a long time ago about the connection between them and Waltzing Matilda. One of the old Lady Nicholson at Broch, her first cousin, was responsible for the music for Waltzing Matilda.
And any second now, we're going to get John, if he thinks he's off the hook, we're going to get him to sing us Waltzing Matilda.
No, my guitar's got a broken string.
You did tell us that you used to write poems and songs when you were younger, John, so I don't think it's so far-fetched to think that you might be able to sing to us.
Not today, no. Not today.
You need a bit of warning if you're going to be performing.
A little bit, yeah. Indeed.
So I think
catch him after a couple of beers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Jane, you might have what they call a portfolio career these days. Is that right?
I'm glad there's a name for it.
So how long have you guys been out of Shetland then? When did you move away?
10 years past in April.
Yeah. 10 years. I think for me, I lived a lot abroad when I was younger, so it's never been one of those things that you see on the television for me. I've just been living in Europe is very much second nature to me. It's not, mainland Europe, I mean, because Britain is still part of Europe. Perhaps we shouldn't go near that one, but it's second nature for me to live in a country where I have to speak another language all the time. And without it, there's sort of a little bit of me missing. So
John, do you speak Spanish now then, if you've been there for 10 years?
Jane speaks it better than I do. Let's put it that way.
But is it like, is the kind of the locality of where you are, would people tend, most of them, to be able to speak English?
No, nobody speaks English.
Nobody, no. And added to that, the accent, the dialect here is very different from what you'll find in Madrid. It's difficult to understand the people here. Mm-hmm. They drop all the S's off the ends of words and things like that, and it's just strange.
So now, John, you'll be able to empathise with an English person moving to Shetland.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I do see the point there. Indeed, yes.
So, do you get home, as in up to Shetland, much, or is that?
We are home.
Oh, you're in Shetland just now?
No, we're in Spain.
Oh yeah, no, sorry. I mean, do you ever get back to Shetland? That's what I meant. I shouldn't call it home when you've not been there for 10 years, I guess.
I was there, me and Frank. Frank's our son. He's 21. We were up last August for a couple of weeks, which was the first time, I think, in 4 or 5 years, yeah. So not very often, really, no.
And do you think you could ever imagine yourselves moving back to Shetland?
Not really, no.
It's a tough one, actually, because it's currently our thoughts are totally consumed by how we remain in Spain after Brexit with all the rights that we've currently got. And I think we look at moving back to Britain, or if we moved back to Britain, probably we would move to Shetland, yes, but we look at that as a last resort.
So is
that right?
I was waiting to hear what John had to say, if he agreed.
Yeah.
No, I agree. No, absolutely, yes, no. That's pretty much it, yes.
Is the current state of play that people just don't know what will happen in terms of being from the UK? Is that right?
That's it. Europe made the offer about 2-3 weeks ago. The European Union made the offer to give all the people, that is to say, the European people living in Britain and British people living in various parts of Europe, to give them all the rights we've already got. Nothing changes. Mm-hmm. But Theresa May came up with another idea and came up with something that was offering everybody something less than what we've currently got. So the talks continue, and we'll have to see how it goes. But Europe is prepared to give us what we want. Britain is not, unfortunately. Unless things...
I think it must be the first time in history, when you look back through history, like, the wars in Asia that Britain has begun, like the Opium Wars in China and so on. We're all about protecting British interests abroad, the interests of British individuals almost in some cases abroad. And this is the first time that it's almost as though we're off the agenda completely. And it's a little bit upsetting because although we have some options, but they're options that nobody ought to have to make. So we're eligible for Spanish nationality, and I have absolutely no hesitation in applying for it, but it means we'd have to give up our British nationality and our British passports because there's no dual nationality in Spain at the moment with Britain. Whereas people in Germany, for example, can apply for dual nationality. We can't. So to me, that's an issue that hasn't been highlighted even remotely enough in the British press, and it needs to be, because our situation is not only different from a lot of EU citizens living in the UK, it's different in each country that you go to in Europe. So we don't really have many choices in that respect. We either give up our British nationality to become Spanish, or we remain with a great deal of uncertainty, because I'm not entirely sure that uncertainty is going to end with the 2 years of the Brexit negotiations. I've never had much faith in what the British government can do to help us, I'm afraid. I trust the EU 10 times. No, I trust the EU an infinite number of times better than I trust the British government to help us. And I think I always think that the EU, we living here and reading the European press every day like we do, is a completely different image that you're given. I've just come back from Germany, and the German impression of the whole business with Brexit is one of complete aghast. It's like, this is just pure suicide. The image that you have is a bunch of lemmings running towards a cliff. And in Spain, it's the same. People are. In fact, somebody asked me at one point when just before the referendum on the European Union. It was quite an old person, and she assumed the referendum was that Britain wanted to join the European Union. Leaving it was so completely out of the scope of belief.
That's a lovely story. No matter which way the listener may have voted, that is a fantastic story. That she was wondering if we would join it.
I think you can safely assume that people here are just surprised that a country that had always come over as being reasonably sensible and had a history of grandeur and all kinds of things could behave in such an incredibly childish way. And that's how the image still resonates here of that sort of, I think, irresponsibility is the word that might come over as describing it.
So I'm surprised that you would not be able to get dual citizenship. So is that down to individual European countries then? So say if you're in Germany, you could get dual German-British. If you were in France, you maybe could. But is Spain individual that way, or is that something that's across some of the other European countries? Do you know?
It's individual. Each country has its individual conditions. So in Germany, you could have dual citizenship. And my cousin lives in Germany. She's married to a German, and she has dual citizenship already. Mm-hmm. And in Spain, it's not possible. It's only possible with one or two South American countries, which are because of the old ties between Spain and South America.
Oh, so Spain has relatively restrictive rules on that then? Because I know a guy he's Turkish originally, but he lives near Aberdeen, and he's got dual citizenship with the UK. And Turkey's not even part of the European Union. So I always assumed it was relatively relaxed, and you could kind of, if you'd lived somewhere long enough, you could kind of blag yourself dual citizenship. Evidently not.
No, in fact, that's one of the anomalies. Sorry, I'll say this and then I'll shut up. But that's one of the anomalies of this. The rules have been completely wiped out. It's as though logic has been completely wiped out, and all these things are coming to the surface now. Mm-hmm. That individuals, people who have lives and families, are going to be so dramatically affected by these things that and there's no one rule or one set of rules to govern it. Okay, you can speak now.
I was going to say that last year, Spain gave Jewish people, that is the descendants of the Jews who were thrown out of Spain in 1492, gave them the right to apply for dual citizenship because they felt it was wrong that they'd thrown out their ancestors 500 years ago. So Spain could do it. They could make a special case for British people living in Spain. They're caught up in this mix-up. But whether or not they will do it is another story. But there is a precedent for doing that.
I think they would do it if the British government made it part of the negotiations. But not only is it not being highlighted sufficiently in the press, the British government don't seem to have us on the agenda. So there are so many stages before that can happen. Yeah,
I think maybe the British government have got a few other things on their mind, like only just scraping through the last election.
Yeah,
so maybe
we noticed.
At least you can always move back to the sunny Shetland Islands, though. And according to Lord Lamont, when I interviewed him, he thought that if there was a second independence referendum, then Shetland could go its own way and become independent. So there you go. You could end up in an independent state of Shetland when you get thrown out of Spain.
Oh my goodness, yes. Right. Well,
let's hope that
might
doesn't
not
happen.
need to go there, but it isn't simple like that. No, and I'd like to anticipate anybody's thoughts who think, well, if you don't like it, come back, because it's not that simple. We have a house here. This is our house. It's our only house. My son, my younger son, Frank, has practically grown up here since he was 11, and his entire world is Spanish, including the language. He's completely bilingual. Mm-hmm. And our work is here. My work is here. And although I can do some of it from anywhere, my work is still here. And our friends are here. And I don't think we could even, if you look at it economically, afford to move back to Shetland. So what, how would that work? And you have to sort of think of people. I often think of people just before, in the 30s around Europe, before Nazism took hold and things. And I think, at what point did the people who got out realize it was going to get so bad that they had the sense to get out and the resources to get out? Because you can't just leave. You can't just up and leave everything you've got when you've got nothing to go to.
No, it's not always that simple, is it? These things are always simple in hindsight. You might look back to just before World War II and say, well, why wouldn't you have got out of Germany or whatever country? But of course, if it had been that clear and simple and possible, people would have. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I don't think that, I'm saying that really to anticipate anyone saying, well, why don't you just come back? Because it's not like that. It's not that simple. I've always had difficulty getting work with languages in Britain, ever since I left university. And I don't think they're valued in Britain. They're valued elsewhere, but I've never felt that they were valued in Britain, or indeed that the English language was valued in Britain, to be perfectly honest.
That's probably a fair criticism, yes. Yeah.
So, that's what my work consists of mostly. And, how do you do that somewhere else? How do you leave a life that you've really spent a lot of energy building up for 10 years and just leave it all behind? And at 58, John? Yes, I think I'm 58. Suddenly have to start again.
What was that, John?
She was asking if she was 58. She is 58.
Good man. I'm glad to see you keeping a track of her birthdays.
He knows better than I do. Yeah. So you can't just leave all that behind. You can't just. Everyone who says that really has no idea what living abroad means, because when you come here, it's an adventure a little bit, but it's also a very, very practical process. You have to build it up. You have to learn the system. You have to learn the language better than you knew it before you left. You have to build up work and contacts and things like that. And just leaving all that behind when, John's retired now, but he's not retired in terms of work, but he's retirement age. Mm-hmm. And I'm 58. I don't think anybody could possibly have any concept of what that would mean.
No, absolutely. Have you got any other thoughts or anything else you'd like to add for anyone back in Shetland who might be listening to this conversation before we sign off?
Well, fight for another referendum on Brexit.
I can't believe how political this podcast is turning. John, save me.
It's an indication of how it's disrupted our lives.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Whatever, yes.
I'm still waiting for John to sing us a wee sea shanty from his days on the Fetlar ferry.
No, I think not today, no.
No, oh well. Wait, is there anywhere we can see any of your writing, like your poems or anything? Do you have a website or anything?
No, not really, no. Well, yes, I do have a website. That's writesystem.com. WRITESYSTEM.com. But it's been a few years since I updated it, so it's probably a bit out of date.
Can you spell that out again slowly, just to make sure people get it if they're going to have a look?
WRITESYSTEM, rightsystem.com.
.com.
Yeah.
Perfect. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, John and Jane Coutts. Lovely talking to you. I hope the signal was okay for you. There were a couple of times where it broke down, so hopefully I can edit out any bits that were too mashed up.
Yeah.
If not, hopefully people will forgive us for the crackles in a few places due to the distance and the Skype signal. But thanks again for your time and for your stories and so on and your contribution. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. No, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jane and John Coutts, and we'd love to hear who else you would like to hear us interview on the podcast. Any comments, feedback, a review would be hugely welcome on iTunes. Really appreciated. Thanks again. See you next time.